So here we go. Here are some of my favorite facts from this past year. A lot of these come from a larger list that was compiled by theideafarm.com. So shout out to them for their legwork and finding a lot of these interesting gems. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. Of the 87 of America's startup companies that are worth more than $1 billion, over half of them, 44, were started by immigrants. If you invested $100 in Berkshire Hathaway back in 1965 and took that all the way through the end of 2023, your $100 investment would be worth $4,255,516. Just an astronomical growth over that time. If you invested that same $100 in the S&P 500 index fund, it would have grown to a very respectable $30,811 over that same time frame, but absolutely dwarfed by Berkshire Hathaway. Like, Berkshire Hathaway's returns were so phenomenal over that time that, get this, if Berkshire Hathaway lost 99% of its value, it still would have beaten the S&P 500 index over that 59-year time period. Japan became the 5th country to land a spacecraft on the moon. Not a person, but a spacecraft on the moon. And we landed several people on the moon back in the 1960s and 70s and have not been back since, but maybe we will be going back again soon. We'll see. Back in the late 1970s, almost 75% of companies paid a dividend. In 2021, that number declined to 35%. So it used to be a given that when you invest in stocks, most of them paid out a dividend to the shareholders. Today, about 1 in 3 do. Japan's stock market hit a record high in February of 2024. That's significant because it took them 34 years to break their previous stock market high. If you'll remember, if you're old enough to remember, back in the late 80s and early 90s, Japan's stock market went through a massive bubble, probably the largest stock market bubble in history. Their companies were just so tremendously overvalued that when that bubble burst, it damaged their stock market and their economy to such an extent that it took them 34 years to replace their previous record high. 3 of the 10 largest economies in the world, China, India, and Brazil, are emerging markets, but they account for almost 25% of global GDP. So just so you understand the way we categorize economies, there's developed markets, then there's emerging markets, and then there's what we'd consider third world economies. Almost all of the money that's invested in publicly traded stocks are from companies in developed countries. Think United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, Japan, Australia, economies like this. Very established and very strong economies. However, China, India, and Brazil are up and coming. They're certainly not third world economies, but they're not considered developed economies just yet. And they account for, again, almost a fourth of the global output, but relatively speaking, they have very little of the total share of publicly traded funds that people invest in. So interesting. Also, speaking of emerging markets, since their introduction as an asset class, as their own separate category in 1988, emerging market stocks have actually outperformed developed markets over that time frame. Keep in mind there's a reason for that. Emerging markets are, by definition, more risky, more prone to economic uncertainty or even political uncertainty. So there is a little bit more risk-reward factor there, but interesting to note that the emerging market stocks have actually done better than developed market stocks during that time period. In 2023, McDonald's bought 2 billion eggs from the agribusiness giant Cargill. So just McDonald's alone, think about how many eggs we consume. We've been talking about a lot about egg prices here recently. Just McDonald's, 2 billion eggs. The absolutely just staggering logistics of how many eggs we need to harvest every single year just in America alone is really, really kind of staggering. The largest cruise ship in the world, Icon of the Seas, set sail for the first time in 2024. The ship has 20 decks. It is 1,200 feet long, so it's actually longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. It is an absolutely massive structure, a floating structure, and it can accommodate over 7,000 passengers on board. Depending on who you are, maybe that sounds like an amazingly good time or an absolute nightmare, but either way, I think they're doing pretty well. The largest cruise ship ever set sail in 2024. There are 33 million Starbucks Rewards members, so essentially 1 in 10 Americans our Starbucks Starbucks Rewards members. At the end of March of 2024, there was almost $2 billion worth of stored card value on Starbucks's balance sheet. So if you're out there and you're a Starbucks Rewards member, don't forget to use your gift card balances. I mean, that's just absolutely astounding that essentially they have $2 billion on their books. That's just money that people haven't redeemed quite yet. Going back to Apple. Apple's on this list a few times. Since its initial public offering in 1981, when it became a publicly listed stock, Apple has created $2.7 trillion in wealth in stock market cap, more than any other company in American history. During that same time period, though, Apple had 3 separate times where the stock dropped 70% or more from its previous high. So it's easy to look back and say, hey, I wish I had invested in Apple way back in the day. That would be so awesome. I'd have so much money. But if you actually invested in Apple, it would have been quite the emotional roller coaster, and it would have been very, very difficult for you to actually have held onto that stock and not sold at inopportune times along the way. And it just goes to show that that's why investing has to be for the long term. I mean, it's going to be a roller coaster ride, especially if you're investing in a single stock, which kind of goes back to some other previous episodes I talked about, which is why I don't recommend individual stock purchases. But I'm starting to go down a rabbit trail. Let's go to the next fact. New York City. Sorry to tell you, you have been unseated as the rudest city in America. I know that was a title that you held proudly. The trophy now goes to Miami, Florida. It scored a 9.88 out of 10 on the rudeness score scale, according to a study by Preply. They consider disrespectful behaviors like being inconsiderate toward others and being loud in public spaces. So apparently Miami is the rudest city in the country. I've lived in Florida for the last 7 years, never been to Miami. I may be going soon. So if you've been to Miami or you live in Miami, maybe you can speak to this, but apparently Miami is now the rudest city in America, which ironically, I have to say, I'm sorry, Miami, but you do have a lot of people from New York, so maybe it's just the rudeness is migrating with people down south from New York. Okay, sorry. Sorry to throw shade at Miami. Going back to Apple for a second, they have spent over $20 billion to produce original TV shows and movies with their streaming service, Apple TV+. Unfortunately for them, they generate less viewing in 1 month than Netflix does in 1 day. So Netflix is still, I think, king of streaming at this point. In 2024, the second largest gem quality diamond in the world was unearthed in Botswana. The rock weighs more than a pound. It's 2,500 carats, and it would barely fit in a person's palm. The company that owns the mine said likely what's going to happen is they're going to take that diamond and cut it into multiple smaller stones, which seems a real shame for a diamond of that size, but hey, what do I know about diamonds? The largest gem diamond ever found was the Cullinan diamond back in 1905, and they chopped that up into over 100 smaller gems, and a lot of them are part of the British crown jewels. Apple, once again, it's all over this list. Their 2023 revenue, which was almost $400 billion, would make it, just Apple itself, about as big as the entire economy of Denmark or the Philippines. Just wild. In 2023, millionaires accounted for 1.5% of the adult population of the United States. So 1.5 people out of 100 are millionaires in the United States, but the US has 38% of all millionaires worldwide. Americans throw away up to $68 million in coins every year, which totally makes sense because if it were not for my kids and giving them the change for them to put in their piggy banks, I probably would be throwing away pennies and nickels and dimes all the time. At the end of 2022, there are now more $100 bills in circulation than $1 bills. That was pretty wild. I don't see a lot of $100 bills in circulation. I assume that $100 bills are only used by like drug dealers and people who are involved in illegal activities, because I mean, like, who's giving you change for $100 bills? The few times in my life where I've tried to get change for a $100 bill, I mean, it felt like an act of Congress. So, but apparently there's more $100 bills out there than $1 bills now. In 2024, India had the largest election in human history. 642 million people voted in the Indian election to elect their members of parliament. 642 million is almost twice the population, the entire population of the United States, and of course, not everybody in the United States is of voting age. Crazy, just the logistics to get something like that done. In 2024, Americans spent $186 billion on their pets, and that's more than was spent on childcare. I will let you take from that what you will. At the end of June in 2024, 8.5% of U.S. homes were listed for $1 million or more, which is the highest share of all time. Of course, that's not evenly spread across the country. That's mainly, markets like California, New York, and Miami, and some of the more expensive housing markets. You're going to see a lot more houses listed for $1 million than, Arkansas or Oklahoma. But we've seen housing prices jump quite a bit. I will say that here recently, some of those hottest markets that were really taking off have shrunk back a little bit here recently, so maybe that share has declined somewhat since June of last year, but still, just highlights how expensive the housing market has got. Here's an interesting one. The U.S. has built more commercial nuclear reactors, in the past 25 than it has major commercial airports, which is 0. That was a little bit depressing to me because I feel like that's part of what we're losing in America is the ability to construct major projects like commercial airports. If you've traveled abroad, traveled to other countries, you know that like some of our marquee airports, the first impression many people have coming to the United States for the first time, LAX and JFK and some of these airports, they're dated, they're worn, and the fact that we have not built a major commercial airport in the past 25 years, I think speaks something to kind of where we're at with construction and projects and our ability to do things like we used to. So anyway, on to the next fact. A report published in 2024 said that the most likely region or the most popular region for UFO sightings, or UAP as they are now referred to, is the American West, which was not surprising at all. A lot of reasons for this. Area 51, Roswell, but the American West, a lot of military installations, clear skies, good weather, low light pollution. Seems like a likely area for a lot of people to report UFOs. The emissions that a modern tractor trailer puts out are 1/75th of what a tractor trailer put out in the 1980s, which is just absolutely wild. Like, I wouldn't want to stand behind a modern tractor trailer truck and breathe in that air for that long. But can you imagine? That's a 1/75th of what it used to be. Yikes. So that's good news. Lastly, this is just a fun one. If you shuffle a deck of cards, this is not a 2024 fact, but I'm throwing it in as a 2024 fact. If you shuffle a deck of cards, it is almost certain that that combination of cards, that order of cards, has never ever existed in history ever. And if you think about this for a second, okay, with 2 cards, there's 2 possible combinations. With 3 cards, 6 possible combinations. With 4 cards, 24. With 5 cards, 120, and on and on. By the time you get to 52 cards, it is an astronomically high number. So every time you shuffle a deck of cards, like 52 card pack, that order almost certainly has never ever existed in history, which is just kind of an interesting fact. And last fact is that was not 24 facts, that was 25, and I guess this fact makes it 26, so who's counting?